The cracked earth beneath Beatrice Kendall's boots felt like a mirror to her breaking heart, and she knew if rain did not come within the next 2 weeks, she would lose everything her father had built in the 23 years before fever took him. The ranch house stood weathered and defiant against the relentless California sun, its paint long since bleached to the color of old bones, and the land surrounding it stretched out in waves of brown, where green had once flourished. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dust across her forehead, and surveyed the dying cattle that clustered around the nearly dry water trough. 3 had already perished this month, and the rest looked like they would follow soon enough if something did not change. Quartz Hill, California had seen dry spells before in this year of 1882, but nothing like this. The summer had arrived with a vengeance that seemed almost personal, and the drought had settled over the land like a curse. The creek that had once run clear and cold through the eastern portion of her property now showed nothing but smooth stones and the skeletal remains of fish that had not escaped in time. Her neighbors to the south had already sold their land for pennies on the dollar to a banker from San Francisco, and the family to the north had simply packed up and left in the night, abandoning everything they could not fit in their wagon. Beatrice refused to surrender so easily. Her father, Thomas Kendall, had chosen this land with care, had built the ranch from nothing with his own 2 hands after her mother died giving birth to her. She had no siblings, no family left to speak of, and this ranch was all she had of him now that he was gone. At 21 years old, she found herself alone in a world that did not look kindly on women trying to run their own operations. And the drought was just one more obstacle in a long line of challenges she had faced since his death, 8 months prior. She walked back toward the house, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The vegetable garden she had planted in the spring had withered to nothing despite her best efforts to keep it watered. Every drop was precious now, rationed between herself, the livestock, and the desperate hope that something might still grow. She had stopped washing her clothes weeks ago, stopped bathing except for the bare minimum, stopped doing anything that might waste even a single cup of water. Inside the house, the air was barely cooler than outside. She poured herself a small glass of water from the dwindling supply in the barrel and drank it slowly, savoring each swallow. Her financial situation was nearly as dire as her water shortage. She had exactly $47 left to her name, and the feed store in town had already cut off her credit. The cattle were surviving on what dry grass they could find, but it was not enough to keep them healthy, and she knew their value was dropping by the day. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She was not expecting visitors, and few people came out this way anymore. Setting down her glass, she crossed to the door and opened it to find herself looking at a tall man she did not recognize. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty from travel, and his hat shaded a face that was sun-darkened and handsome in a rugged way. His eyes were a striking blue-green, like the ocean she had seen once as a child, and they studied her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must look, covered in dust and sweat. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried a hint of Texas in its vowels. "Name is Vincent Brennan. I saw your fence line riding in, and it looks like you might be running cattle. I am looking for work, and I am wondering if you might be hiring." Beatrice felt her heart sink. Of all the times for a capable-looking ranch hand to appear, this was perhaps the worst. "I appreciate you stopping by, Mr. Brennan, but I am afraid I cannot afford to hire anyone right now. The drought has hit us hard, and I am barely keeping things together as it is." Vincent nodded slowly, his gaze moving past her to take in what he could see of the property. I noticed the dry creek bed on the way in. How long since it ran? 6 weeks, she admitted. The well is getting low too. I give it another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I am lucky. What about other water sources? Any springs on the property? Other creeks or streams? She shook her head. My father looked years ago when he first settled here. That creek was all we ever found. Vincent was quiet for a moment, and she watched something shift in his expression, a thoughtfulness that suggested he was considering something carefully. Madam, I know this might sound strange coming from someone you just met, but I have some experience finding water. Underground water, I mean. Back in Texas, I worked for a rancher who taught me the old methods of divining where to dig wells. Beatrice felt a flicker of something she had not experienced in weeks, something that might have been hope. Water witching. I have heard of it, but I always thought it was just superstition. Some folks feel that way, Vincent acknowledged, but I have seen it work more times than not. I would be willing to take a look around your property, see if I can find anything, in exchange for meals and a place to sleep for a few days. If I find water, maybe we can talk about me staying on to help. If I do not, then I will move along and you are only out some food. She studied him carefully, weighing the offer. Food was something she had more of than water, thanks to her stores of beans and salt pork, and having an extra pair of hands around the place would be helpful even for just a few days. There was also something about Vincent Brennan that inspired a cautious trust, though she could not have explained why if pressed. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, or the lack of the condescension she had grown accustomed to from men who thought she had no business trying to run a ranch alone. "All right," she said finally. "You can stay in the bunkhouse. It is not much, but it has a roof and a bed. I will feed you and you can look for water. If you find it, we will discuss payment then." A smile crossed his face, transforming it from merely handsome to genuinely appealing. "That is fair, madam. I appreciate the opportunity. Call me Beatrice," she said. "Or Miss Kendall if you prefer to be formal, but madam makes me feel like an old woman." "Beatrice it is, then," he replied. "And you can call me Vincent or Vince if that is easier." She showed him to the bunkhouse, which had not been used since her father's last hired hand had left 3 years ago. It was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but Vincent assured her it would do fine. She left him to settle in and returned to the house, her mind spinning with this unexpected development. She wanted desperately to believe that he could find water, but she had been disappointed so many times in recent months that she was afraid to let that hope take root. That evening, she prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and Vincent joined her on the porch to eat as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The heat of the day was finally beginning to ease, though the air remained thick and oppressive. "How long have you been running this place alone?" Vincent asked between bites. "My father passed 8 months ago," Beatrice replied. "Fever took him fast. One day he was fine, and 3 days later he was gone. He had taught me the business over the years, so I knew what needed doing, but there is a difference between helping and being in charge." "I imagine that is true," Vincent said quietly. "Must be especially hard in a drought year." "Everything has been hard," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. She had grown so used to projecting strength and capability that it felt strange to acknowledge struggle to anyone. "The other ranchers in the area do not take me seriously. Half of them have made offers to buy the place, always for far less than it is worth. They are circling like vultures, waiting for me to fail. But you are not planning to fail." It was a statement rather than a question, and Beatrice found herself appreciating that. "No, I am not. My father loved this land, and he built something good here. I am not going to let it die just because the world thinks a woman cannot do this work." Vincent nodded, his expression thoughtful. My mother ran a boarding house in Fort Worth after my father died. I was just a boy, maybe 10 years old. Folks told her she could not do it, that she should sell and move back east to live with relatives. She proved every single one of them wrong. Ran that place for 15 years before she passed, and it was the most successful boarding house in the city by the time she was done. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Vincent agreed. Stubborn as a mule and twice as tough. I see some of that same steel in you, if you do not mind me saying so. Beatrice felt heat rise to her face that had nothing to do with the temperature. I will take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and Beatrice found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. Vincent Brennan had an easy manner about him, a quiet confidence that was different from the swagger she had seen in so many cowboys. He did not seem to feel the need to fill every silence with talk, and there was something restful about his presence. "Tell me about this water divining," she said eventually. "How does it work?" Vincent set down his empty plate and leaned back against the porch post. "The old-timer who taught me used a forked willow branch. He would hold it loose in his hands and walk the property, and when he passed over water, the branch would pull down toward the ground. He said it was something about the energy of the water calling to the living wood, but I do not know if that is true or just poetry. What I do know is that it worked. I watched him find water for 5 different ranches, and every time we dug where he said, we hit water." "And you learned to do it yourself?" "I did. Took me a while to get the feel for it, but eventually I could sense it too. It is hard to describe. Your hands know before your mind does. You feel this pull, this sense of something beneath the earth." Beatrice wanted to scoff at the mysticism of it, but she found she could not. Desperation had a way of opening the mind to possibilities that might otherwise be dismissed. "When will you start looking?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you. Best to do it early before the heat of the day sets in." She agreed, and they parted ways for the night. Beatrice lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch around her. The wind moved through the dry grass with a rustling whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. She thought about Vincent Brennan walking her property with a willow branch, seeking water that might or might not exist, and she found herself praying to a God she had mostly stopped believing in that he would find something. Morning arrived with the same brutal sun as every other day. Beatrice rose before dawn and made coffee and breakfast, and Vincent appeared just as she was setting food on the table. He looked well rested and ready for the day ahead, and she envied his apparent optimism. After they ate, Vincent cut a forked branch from the willow tree that grew near the house, one of the few trees that had not completely succumbed to the drought, thanks to its deep roots. He tested the branch's flexibility, nodded in satisfaction, and then looked at Beatrice. "I am going to walk the property in a grid pattern," he explained. "Start near the house and work my way out. It might take most of the day, depending on how much ground we are talking about." 200 acres, Beatrice told him. "Most of it is grazing land, but there are some rocky areas to the west that we have never used for anything." Vincent's eyes lit up with interest. "Rocky areas. That is promising. Sometimes water flows through underground channels in rock formations. I will make sure to cover that section carefully." They set out together, Vincent in the lead with the willow branch held loosely in his hands, and Beatrice following a few steps behind. She felt foolish at first, walking across her own land behind a man with a stick, but Vincent seemed completely focused on his task. He moved slowly and deliberately, his attention fixed on the ground ahead and the branch in his hands. For the first hour, nothing happened. They crossed the area near the house, moved through the dead vegetable garden, and worked their way toward the cattle pasture. The sun climbed higher, and Beatrice felt sweat begin to trickle down her spine. The cattle watched them pass with disinterest, too depleted by heat and hunger to be curious. They were nearing the western edge of the property, where the land began to rise into rocky outcroppings when Vincent suddenly stopped. Beatrice nearly walked into him, so abrupt was his halt. "What is it?" she asked. Vincent did not answer immediately. He was staring at the willow branch, and Beatrice saw that it had begun to move. The forked ends were pulling downward, bending toward the earth as though drawn by an invisible force. Vincent took a step forward, then another, and the movement became more pronounced. "Here," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "There is water here." Beatrice looked at the ground beneath their feet. It appeared no different from any other section of the ranch, perhaps rockier than some areas but otherwise unremarkable. "How deep?" "I cannot say for certain," Vincent admitted, "but the pull is strong, which usually means it is not too far down. 20 feet, maybe 30 at most." Hope and skepticism warred within her. "Even if you are right, I do not have the money to hire someone to dig a well. I could barely afford the equipment if I did have the labor." Vincent turned to look at her, and the determination in his eyes was striking. "Then we dig it ourselves. It will take longer and it will be hard work, but it can be done. I have helped dig wells before. I know what needs doing." "Vincent, that could take weeks. I cannot ask you to do that for just food and lodging." "You are not asking. I am offering." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Look, I have been drifting from place to place for the past year, taking work where I could find it, but never staying anywhere long. I left Texas after the woman I thought I would marry decided she would rather have a shopkeeper with reliable hours and clean hands. I have been trying to figure out what I want where I belong. Maybe I ended up here for a reason. Maybe this is where I am supposed to be." Beatrice felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I still could not pay you what you are worth. We will work something out if we find water. For now, let us just focus on that." He smiled at her and she felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unfamiliar. "Do you have shovels, picks, rope?" "In the barn," she confirmed. "Then let us get started." The next 3 weeks became a blur of back-breaking labor and growing hope. Vincent proved to be as good as his word, working from dawn until dusk with a determination that both impressed and humbled Beatrice. She worked alongside him, refusing to let him carry the burden alone, and together they dug into the earth one shovelful at a time. The first few feet were relatively easy, just dirt and small rocks that yielded readily to their efforts. But as they went deeper, they hit harder soil and larger rocks that needed to be broken apart with picks and hauled out with rope. Vincent rigged a simple pulley system using equipment from the barn, which made removing the debris easier, and they fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. They talked as they worked, sharing stories and histories in the way that people do when engaged in difficult tasks together. Beatrice learned that Vincent was 26 years old, that he had been working cattle since he was 14, and that his dream had once been to own his own ranch someday. He spoke of his travels through Texas and New Mexico, of the people he had met and the places he had seen. And Beatrice found herself fascinated by his tales of a wider world than she had known. In turn, she told him about her childhood, about her father's quiet strength, and her mother's memory that lived only in stories Thomas Kendall had shared. She spoke of her education, how her father had insisted she learn to read and write and cipher, unusual for a girl in their circumstances, but something he had believed essential. She confessed her loneliness since his death, the weight of carrying everything alone. "You are not alone anymore," Vincent said one evening as they sat on the porch, their muscles aching and their hands blistered despite the gloves they wore. "I mean, I know I am just hired help, or will be if this works out, but you have got someone to share the load now." Beatrice looked at him, at the genuine concern in his expression, and felt that warmth in her chest grow stronger. Over the course of these weeks, Vincent had become more than just a worker. He had become something close to a friend, and if she was honest with herself, her feelings were beginning to drift into territory beyond friendship. She noticed things about him that had nothing to do with his capacity for labor. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The surprising gentleness with which he handled the sick cattle, checking on them each morning with a tenderness that spoke of genuine care. The sound of his voice in the early morning darkness, rich and warm as he spoke softly to the horses. The strength of his hands, rough and calloused but careful when they needed to be. On the 22nd day of digging, when they were nearly 25 feet down, and Beatrice was beginning to lose faith, Vincent's shovel struck something that was not rock or dirt. He stopped, then dug more carefully, and suddenly water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. "Beatrice," he shouted up to her, his voice ringing with triumph. "We hit it! We found water!" She leaned over the edge of the hole, her heart pounding, and saw the dark wetness spreading across the bottom. As she watched, the seepage increased, becoming a trickle, then a steady flow. Vincent was laughing, actually laughing with joy, and Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Vincent climbed up the rope they had been using to get in and out of the hole, and when he reached the surface, he was grinning wider than she had ever seen. Without thinking, Beatrice threw her arms around him, and he caught her in a tight embrace, spinning her around once before setting her back on her feet. "We need to line the well properly," he said, still beaming. "Stone or timber, whatever we can manage. And we will need to build a proper well head with a pump or a bucket system, but the hard part is done. You have got water, Beatrice. Your ranch is saved." The relief that washed over her was so intense it was almost painful. She had been carrying the weight of impending disaster for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You have given me my life back." Vincent's expression softened, and he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I think maybe you have given me something too. A reason to stay in one place. A purpose. Something worth building toward." They stood there in the fading light, covered in dirt and sweat, and Beatrice knew with sudden clarity that she had fallen in love with Vincent Brennan. It was there in the way her heart raced when he looked at her, in the comfort she felt in his presence, in the way her future had become impossible to imagine without him in it. "Vincent," she began, not sure what she meant to say but needing to say something. He stepped closer, his hand still on her face, and his eyes searched hers. "I know we have not known each other long," he said quietly, "and I know I am just a drifting cowboy without much to my name. But somewhere along the way these past few weeks, I started to care about you as more than just an employer. You are the strongest, most determined woman I have ever met, and I cannot imagine riding away from here now." "Then do not," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do not ride away. Stay. Not as hired help, but as a partner, someone to build this place with, to share it with." Vincent's smile was soft and wondering. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated because I found water. That was just the decent thing to do." "I am not saying this out of obligation," Beatrice replied. "I am saying it because over these past weeks you have become essential to me. Not because of the work you do, but because of who you are. Because I have come to care for you deeply, and I think perhaps you feel the same way." "I do," Vincent confirmed. "I have been falling for you since that first day on the porch, if I am being honest. I just did not know if I had any right to hope you might feel the same." Beatrice reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. Vincent responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. The kiss was long and deep and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I think that answers your question," Beatrice said with a shaky laugh. Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I think it does." Over the next month, they finished the well properly, lining it with stones they hauled from the rocky western section of the property, and building a sturdy wellhead with a pump that Vincent installed with careful precision. The water flowed clear and cold, more than enough to supply the house, and the livestock with plenty to spare. The cattle began to recover their health, filling out as they regained access to adequate water, and the grass began to show hints of green as Beatrice was able to irrigate the most critical pastures. The other ranchers noticed the change. Some came by out of curiosity, wondering how the Kendall place had suddenly turned around. When they saw the new well and the improvements Vincent and Beatrice had made, their attitudes ranged from grudging respect to obvious envy. One in particular, a man named George Hartley who owned the spread to the south, made a pointed comment about how convenient it was that a handsome cowboy had shown up just in time to save the day. Vincent, standing beside Beatrice on the porch when Hartley made his comment, simply smiled and said, "I think it was more that I got lucky finding a woman worth saving the day for." Hartley had nothing to say to that and left in a huff. Beatrice laughed once he was out of earshot. "You are going to make enemies talking like that." "I do not care what men like Hartley think," Vincent replied. "I care what you think." What Beatrice thought was that she had never been happier. With the immediate crisis averted, they were able to focus on rebuilding the ranch and on each other. Vincent proved to be not just a capable ranch hand but a skilled manager, with ideas for improving their operations that Beatrice had never considered. He suggested they focus on breeding quality cattle rather than quantity, to build a reputation for excellence that would command better prices. He helped her repair fences and buildings that had been neglected during the crisis. He brought laughter and warmth back into the house that had been so silent and lonely. They married on a cool day in late October, just as autumn was beginning to settle over California. The ceremony was small, held in the little church in Quartz Hill with only a handful of neighbors in attendance. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, preserved all these years in a trunk, and Vincent wore his best clothes and looked more handsome than any man had a right to. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Vincent kissed her, Beatrice felt like every hardship she had endured had been worth it to reach this moment. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and marveling. Vincent was gentle with her, patient and loving, and Beatrice found joy in the physical expression of what had been growing between them for months. They lay together afterward in the darkness, her head on his chest and his arms around her, and talked about their future. "I want to build this place into something that lasts," Vincent said, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. "Something we can be proud of and maybe pass on to our children someday if we are blessed with any." "I want that too," Beatrice agreed. "I want to prove that we can not only survive but thrive. I want other women to see that it is possible to make your own way, even when the world tells you that you cannot." "We will do it together," Vincent promised. "Whatever comes, we will face it together." The first year of their marriage brought both challenges and triumphs. The drought finally broke in the spring of 1883, bringing rains that turned the land green and lush once more. The creek on the eastern section began to flow again, but the well remained their primary water source, more reliable than depending on rain or surface water. Their cattle herd grew as the animals regained health and began to calve, and Vincent's instinct for breeding proved sound. The quality of their stock began to attract attention from buyers throughout the region. Beatrice found herself stepping into a role she had not expected, managing the business side of the ranch, while Vincent handled most of the physical labor and animal husbandry. She had a head for numbers and contracts, and she discovered that she enjoyed the challenge of negotiating with buyers and suppliers. Together, she and Vincent made a formidable team, each bringing strengths that complemented the other. In the fall of that year, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The joy on Vincent's face when she told him was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down and knelt to place his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he said softly. "Your mama and I cannot wait to meet you." Beatrice ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with love for this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. "We are going to be a family." "We already are," Vincent replied, looking up at her with those blue-green eyes that still made her heart skip. "But I am surely looking forward to growing it." Their son was born in May of 1884, a healthy baby with his father's eyes and his mother's determination, evident even in infancy from the strength of his grip and the volume of his cries. They named him Thomas, after Beatrice's father, and Vincent cried when she told him the name she had chosen. Little Thomas became the center of their world, doted on by both parents and already showing signs of the stubborn independence that ran in his blood. The ranch continued to prosper. They hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, good men who respected Beatrice and were loyal to Vincent. The reputation of the Brennan Ranch, as it had come to be known, spread throughout California and beyond. Buyers began to seek them out specifically, willing to pay premium prices for their cattle. The house was expanded, adding rooms for their growing family and improving the basic structure her father had built. 2 years after Thomas was born, Beatrice delivered a daughter they named Sarah, a quiet baby who rarely cried and watched the world with solemn dark eyes. Where Thomas was all energy and noise, Sarah was contemplative and calm. Vincent was completely smitten with his daughter, and Beatrice often found him in the nursery, just watching Sarah sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I never thought I could love anything as much as I love you," he told Beatrice one night. "But these children, what we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." Beatrice settled into his arms, content and complete in a way she had never imagined during those desperate days of drought. "You saved more than just the ranch when you found that water," she said. "You saved me. You gave me hope when I had none left, and you gave me a future I did not know how to reach for." Vincent kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "You gave me a home, Beatrice, a place to belong and a reason to put down roots. I was lost before I found you, just drifting through life without purpose. You gave me everything that matters." Life was not without its difficulties. There were hard seasons and lean years, cattle that were lost to disease or accident, hands that did not work out and had to be let go. But through it all, Beatrice and Vincent faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned when to push and when to support, learned the 1,000 small ways that love expressed itself in daily life. The children grew and more followed. Another son, James, arrived in 1888 and a second daughter, Margaret, in 1890. The house rang with laughter and noise, with the chaos and joy of a large family. Beatrice watched Vincent with their children and fell in love with him anew, seeing the patience and kindness with which he taught them, the pride he took in their accomplishments, the comfort he offered when they struggled. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent took Beatrice back to the spot where he had first found water. The well still stood, faithfully providing for the ranch as it had from the beginning. Someone, probably Vincent himself, had planted flowers around the wellhead, and they bloomed in cheerful profusion. "This is where everything changed," Vincent said, his arm around her waist. "This is where our life together really began." Beatrice leaned into him, remembering that day with perfect clarity. The desperate hope, the overwhelming relief, the moment she had realized she loved him. "I think it began before that," she said. "The day you knocked on my door and offered to help, that was the beginning." "Maybe it was," Vincent agreed. "Or maybe it was always meant to happen, and we were just finding our way to each other." They stood together in the sunshine, the sound of their children playing in the distance and the ranch thriving around them. And Beatrice knew that whatever forces had brought Vincent Brennan to her door that day had given her the greatest gift she could have imagined. Not just water to save the ranch, but love to save her heart. As the years continued to pass, the Brennan Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the region. Beatrice and Vincent were respected not just for the quality of their cattle, but for the integrity with which they conducted business and the kindness with which they treated their workers. They became pillars of the Quartz Hill community, active in the church and the school, always ready to help neighbors in need. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his mother's head for business and his father's love of the land. Sarah developed a gift with horses that amazed everyone who saw her work with the animals. James inherited his father's skill at finding water and was in demand from other ranchers seeking to dig wells. Margaret showed signs of becoming a teacher, always with her nose in a book, and always ready to help her younger siblings with their lessons. Beatrice sometimes looked around at the life she had built and marveled at how different it was from those desperate days of drought. The fear and loneliness that had defined her existence before Vincent arrived felt like memories from another life, belonging to a different person entirely. She had become stronger, yes, but also softer in the ways that mattered. She had learned to share her burdens and her joys, to trust and to lean on someone else, to open her heart fully to love. Vincent aged well, his hair turning silver at the temples and lines deepening around his eyes, but he remained strong and capable. He still worked the ranch alongside their sons and the hired hands, though Beatrice sometimes insisted he leave the hardest labor to younger men. He would laugh and agree, then go right back to doing exactly as he pleased, and she loved him for his stubbornness. They celebrated their 25th anniversary with a party that filled the house and spilled out into the yard. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and the children, now young adults, organized everything with efficiency that made their parents proud. There were toasts and laughter, music and dancing, and as the sun set over the land they had built together, Vincent led Beatrice in a slow waltz under the stars. 25 years, he murmured. Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. It has been a good life, Beatrice said, her head on his shoulder. Better than I ever dreamed. It is not over yet, Vincent reminded her. We have got a lot more years ahead of us, and I plan to love you through every single one of them. Beatrice lifted her head to look at him, at the face she knew better than her own, at the eyes that still made her heart race. Promise, promise, Vincent confirmed and sealed it with a kiss. As the seasons turned and the new century approached, the Brennan Ranch stood as a testament to determination and love. The well that Vincent had divined all those years ago continued to provide abundant water, sustaining not just their operation, but serving as a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. Vincent had installed a plaque beside the wellhead, simple but meaningful, that read, "Here we found water. Here we found hope. Here we found each other." Thomas eventually took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, though Vincent and Beatrice remained active and involved. They took pleasure in watching their son implement his own ideas while respecting the foundation they had built. Sarah married a horse breeder and established her own operation on the northern section of the property, which Vincent and Beatrice gifted to her as a wedding present. James hired out as a well digger, bringing water to desperate ranchers just as his father had once done for his mother. Margaret did indeed become a teacher, working at the school in Quartz Hill and living in a neat little house in town. The grandchildren began to arrive, and Beatrice discovered that grandparenthood brought its own special joys. She and Vincent spoiled the little ones shamelessly, telling them stories of the old days and teaching them the values that had guided their own lives. Work hard, be honest, help those in need, love deeply and without reservation. On a warm evening in the spring of 1910, as Beatrice and Vincent sat on the porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before, Beatrice reached over and took Vincent's hand. His fingers laced through hers automatically, the gesture as natural as breathing after so many years together. "You remember what you said to me the night after we found the water?" she asked. Vincent smiled, his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "I said a lot of things that night." "You will have to be more specific. You said that somewhere along the way you had started to care for me as more than just an employer, that you could not imagine riding away." "I remember," Vincent confirmed. "It was the truth then, and it is the truth now. Best decision I ever made, stopping at your door that day." "It was fate," Beatrice said with certainty. "It had to be. Of all the ranches in California, of all the desperate situations you could have stumbled across, you found your way to mine. You found water when I needed it most, but more than that, you found me. You saw me, not as a woman who needed saving, but as someone worth standing beside, someone worth building a life with." Vincent turned to face her fully, his expression serious and tender. "You were always worth it, Beatrice. From that very first moment, covered in dust and sweat and still standing tall despite everything trying to break you, I knew you were special. Finding the water was the easy part. Convincing you to let me stay, to take a chance on a drifter with nothing to his name but a willingness to work hard, that was the real challenge. You made it impossible not to love you," Beatrice said softly. "Your kindness, your strength, the way you never once made me feel less capable because I was a woman. You treated me as an equal even when no one else did." "You were my equal," Vincent said. "You still are, in every way that matters." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. The ranch around them was quiet except for the gentle sounds of evening, the cattle settling for the night, the wind moving through the grass that grew lush and green thanks to the water that still flowed from the well Vincent had found so many years ago. "I have been thinking," Vincent said after a while, "when the time comes for us to go, whenever that may be, I would like to be buried near the well. It seems fitting somehow." Beatrice felt her throat tighten but nodded. "That is a good thought. That spot is special, the place where everything changed, where our story really began." "Our story is not over yet," Vincent reminded her with a gentle smile. "We have got plenty of chapters left to write," and they did. They continued to live full and active lives well into their later years, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had nurtured. They saw their grandchildren grow and begin to have children of their own, the next generation that would carry on the Brennan name and legacy. The drought that had threatened to destroy everything had instead been the catalyst for the greatest love story Beatrice had ever known. What had seemed like the end had been a beginning, the darkest hour before the dawn. Vincent had not just found water underground. He had found the woman he was meant to love, and together, they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the house was peaceful, Beatrice would sometimes walk out to the well and stand beside it, remembering. She would think about the terrified woman she had been, facing ruin and dissolution with nothing but stubborn determination to sustain her. She would think about the cowboy who had appeared as if summoned by prayer, offering help without expectation of reward. She would think about the moment the water had first seeped into the bottom of that hole, bringing with it hope and possibility. But most of all, she would think about love. The kind of love that sustained and strengthened, that grew deeper with each passing year, that transformed two individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. She would think about Vincent, her partner and her heart, and she would smile. The ranch would endure. The well would continue to provide. But the real legacy, the thing that mattered most, was the love they had found in the midst of crisis. That was the water that truly sustained them, the underground spring that never ran dry no matter how harsh the season or how difficult the challenge. Years turned into decades, and eventually the time came when Vincent's health began to fail. He faced it with the same quiet courage he had brought to every other challenge in his life, never complaining, always grateful for the life he had lived and the love he had known. Beatrice stayed by his side constantly, holding his hand and remembering all the moments that had made their life together so rich. "No regrets," Vincent told her one afternoon, his voice weak but his eyes still bright. "Not a single one. You gave me everything, Beatrice. Everything I ever wanted or needed. You gave me the same," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Vincent, in every way a person can be saved." He smiled, that beautiful smile that had captured her heart so many years ago. "We saved each other, my love. That is what partners do." Vincent passed peacefully in his sleep a few days later, surrounded by his family. They buried him beside the well, just as he had wished, and Beatrice planted a willow tree over his grave. It seemed only fitting that the tree which had provided the divining branch should mark the resting place of the man who had used it to find water and love. Beatrice lived for several more years, staying active on the ranch and delighting in her ever-growing family. She never remarried. Vincent had been her one true love, and no one could ever take his place. But she was not lonely. She was surrounded by people who loved her, living in the home they had built together, watching the legacy they had created continue to flourish. When her own time came, she faced it without fear. She knew she would be reunited with Vincent, that they would find each other again as they had always been meant to. Her last coherent words were a whisper to Thomas, who sat holding her hand. "Tell them our story. Tell them that love can be found even in the driest, most desperate places. Tell them that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger at the door, offering help without expectation of reward. Tell them to never give up hope." Thomas promised, tears running down his face, and Beatrice closed her eyes for the last time with a smile on her lips. They buried her beside Vincent, beneath the willow tree that had grown tall and strong. The well continued to flow, providing water for generations of Brennans who would come after. And the story of the drought and the cowboy who found water underground became a legend in the family, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had made it all possible. The ranch endured through the changing years, through new challenges and new triumphs. The world moved on, technology advanced, the old ways gave way to the new. But at the heart of the Brennan Ranch, beside the well where water still flowed cold and clear, stood a testament to a love that had conquered drought and desperation, that had transformed two individuals into a partnership that changed everything. The plaque Vincent had installed remained in place, its words as true as the day they were written. Here we found water. Here we found hope. Here we found each other. And beneath those words, added years later by their children, a final line. Here began a love that death itself could not diminish. The story of Beatrice and Vincent Brennan lived on, passed down through the generations as a reminder that love often comes when we need it most, that hope can be found in the darkest times, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are discovered not in spite of hardship, but because of it. The drought that nearly destroyed everything had instead brought together two souls meant to find each other, and from that union had sprung a legacy of love and determination that would echo through the ages. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not the water that flowed from beneath the earth, though that had saved the ranch. Not the prosperity that followed, though that had provided security and comfort. The real miracle was the love that had bloomed in the midst of crisis, that had sustained through decades of life together, that had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after the original participants had passed from the earth. Beatrice had been fighting a losing battle against the drought, and Vincent had helped her find water underground. But in doing so, they had found something far more valuable. They had found each other, and that discovery had made all the difference. Their love story became part of the land itself, as permanent and essential as the water that still flowed from the well, a reminder to all who came after that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, survive any challenge, and create something beautiful and lasting even in the harshest of circumstances. The ranch stood as their monument, but their true legacy lived in the hearts of their descendants, in the values they had instilled and the example they had set. Work hard, be honest, help those in need, love deeply and without reservation. These were the lessons of Beatrice and Vincent Brennan, learned through trial and triumph, tested by time and proved true. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the California hills and the wind moved through the grass, it was said by some of the more romantic family members that you could still feel their presence near the well. Not as ghosts, but as a lingering sense of peace and love, a reminder that the best things in life are often found when we need them most, and that true love, once found, never really dies. It simply transforms, becoming part of the land and the legacy, living on in the stories told and the lives touched, eternal as the water that still flowed clear and cold from the well that had changed everything. That was the real story of the drought and the cowboy, of desperation and salvation, of a woman fighting for survival, and a man who appeared at exactly the right moment to help her find not just water, but hope and love and a future brighter than either of them had dared to imagine. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love proved and tested and found to be eternal. And that, in the end, was the happiest ending of all.